In a small town where daily life seemed stable and uneventful, the disappearance of Jenna Marks, a 16-year-old teenager, shook the foundations of the community. It was September 12, 2024, when Jenna decided to go for a bike ride in the local park. A large park with multiple trails and paths stretching across more than 500 hectares of dense vegetation, perfect for those looking to lose themselves in nature. On that day, Jenna, known for her dedication to sports and her love for cycling, had planned to train for an upcoming school competition. She carried a light backpack, a water bottle, and her inseparable bicycle, not knowing that it would be the last time anyone would see her. The park was a place frequented by locals who often used its trails for walking, running, or cycling. Although the park was a green lung offering refuge and beauty, it also hid solitary nooks, corners where light barely filtered through and nature took control. That day, Jenna had chosen to take one of the less traveled routes, a choice that allowed her to practice in peace, away from crowds. However, that hidden trail in the forest became the last clue about her whereabouts. Jenna's case was not an isolated event. Her disappearance was a disturbing echo of an event that had occurred months before. Melissa Thompson, a distant friend of Jenna's, had disappeared under similar circumstances. Both girls, young and full of life, had taken routes in the park known for being more secluded, out of sight of those who might have seen or heard them. Although the circumstances of their disappearances were vague, the parallels between the two cases could not be ignored. The town, which had been peaceful for many years, began to be engulfed by growing concern and confusion. The news of Jenna's disappearance quickly spread through the town. But this was not just an isolated case. The echoes of what happened to Melissa reverberated in the memories of all the residents. The days following September 12th were a mixture of desperation and hope. The local police, lacking sufficient resources to handle such a large-scale case, immediately began the search. But the park was vast, complicated, and full of paths that offered few clues. Every corner of the park seemed to hide more questions than answers. Investigators, without access to security cameras or direct witnesses, faced an almost impossible mission. The park where Jenna had disappeared was at the same time a natural wonder and the perfect playground for a crime without witnesses. Its trails meandered through wooded areas, uninhabited zones, and small abandoned cabins, places where any action went unnoticed by passers-by. And of course, without surveillance cameras to help identify possible culprits, the investigation became even more challenging. The lack of evidence, along with the passing of time, pushed the officers into a dead end. Jenna's disappearance became a nightmare for both the police and the citizens. The town's parents, particularly those of the missing young women, were plunged into a state of collective panic. Parents began to restrict their children's freedom, who could no longer go out without the fear of becoming the next victim. Children and teenagers, who once pedaled through the park with the same tranquility Jenna had, were now confined to their homes, away from areas where they might have been witnesses or victims of any danger. Meanwhile, rumors began to circulate in the community. Some residents believed the responsible party for the disappearances was a stranger, someone from outside the town who had infiltrated undetected. Others, however, believed the culprit was someone from the same community. Such uncertainty created a tense atmosphere, where distrust between neighbors grew with each new day without clear answers. Under constant pressure, the police intensified their investigations. However, as the days passed, it seemed that the answers moved further away. The town began to split into two groups: those who still held on to hope that Jenna might be alive, waiting to be found, and those who, with the passing of time, had already accepted the grim possibility that the worst scenario was becoming a reality. Local news, authorities, parents, and investigators all felt trapped in a whirlpool of uncertainty. Meanwhile, the community organized into search groups. Dozens of people combed the park, each reviewing the trails, the lesser-known routes, looking for any clue that might have been left behind. But the park, with its vastness and interconnected paths, offered very few pieces of evidence. The place seemed to have swallowed Jenna without a trace, leaving no footprints for the humans to follow. In the midst of all this, Jenna's story intertwined with Melissa's, and the town couldn't help but wonder if there was any connection between the two cases. The police were investigating possible links, but nothing seemed to fit. The anguish grew and desperation began to be palpable. In every corner of the park, in every glance between neighbors, in every rumor that circulated, everyone seemed to suspect that something much darker was lurking. Something that had been present but never noticed until it was too late. The situation became more complicated when new disappearances began to occur in the same area, always near the park, and, in many cases, at similar times. Each case seemed to add more pieces to the puzzle, but also complicated the investigations further. Every clue found in the park led to a dead end, and the weeks continued to pass without any concrete answers emerging. Eventually, the town found itself trapped in a cycle of fear with a clear sense of insecurity. The park, which once was a place of leisure, had now become the epicenter of an unsolved mystery, and the residents could not help but look suspiciously at their own neighbors. No one felt safe. Fear had taken control, and what had once seemed like a peaceful town was now marked by silence and distrust. The feeling of insecurity in the air was palpable. The constant question was, who was behind these crimes, and why did it seem that no one could stop it? Jenna Marks was not an ordinary young woman. She was 16 years old and had a contagious energy that lit up everything around her. Passionate about cycling, she had a clear goal: to stand out in the upcoming school mountain bike competition, which would take place at the end of the month. She had always been determined and disciplined, traits that made her an example in her school and community. Since she was young, her family had encouraged her to follow her dreams, and although she was somewhat reserved, she always had a kind word for everyone. Her parents, especially her mother Karen, had a deep connection with her that transcended the mother-daughter bond, rooted in mutual respect and trust. Jenna was the emotional pillar of her family. Her joy and enthusiasm for life kept her parents active and motivated. Cycling was more than a passion for Jenna. It represented a way to achieve freedom, an escape where she could be herself, away from social or school expectations. At home, she was known for her strict discipline, and everyone knew that, although young, she had the maturity to face life's challenges. However, her emotional detachment from the insecurity of the outside world made her less aware of the dangers, lurking in places she thought were safe, like the park she frequented. The day Jenna disappeared, she was at a crucial stage in her life. She had begun to train more rigorously for the competition, seeking to perfect her technique and endurance. But that day, like others before it, she decided to go out alone, a seemingly simple decision that made all the difference. Despite the competition's proximity and the sense of urgency in her training, Jenna enjoyed the independence cycling gave her, and at that moment, she did not think about the risks. The strong and determined woman everyone knew disappeared in the most bewildering way. Suddenly, without a trace, without a shout, with no indication of what had happened. Karen, her mother, was the first to notice Jenna's absence. Even though the young woman had always been respectful of the set times that day, Karen felt a slight unease as the hours passed and her daughter did not return. Karen knew Jenna's routine, and her daughter never came home late without explanation. At first, the mother's calmness led her to think that Jenna might have decided to stay longer in the park, enjoying the day. But as the afternoon wore on and there was no news, her unease grew. Jenna's mother, in her desperation, began searching the park, wondering if there was something more behind her daughter's disappearance. Minutes turned into hours and hours into days. Karen fought against an unbearable pain, a pain aggravated by uncertainty. What terrified her most was not understanding how her daughter had disappeared without leaving any trace. The bond between mother and daughter was so deep that, for Karen, Jenna's disappearance represented the loss of something irreplaceable, a void that could never be filled. Without answers, fear and anguish began to take hold of her. But she couldn't give up. Karen was a woman of faith and action, so she quickly set about organizing searches, speaking with the police, and questioning everyone for clues. All Karen wanted was to find her daughter, hug her once more, and tell her everything was fine. However, the search seemed to be plunging into a maze without an exit. Detective Keith, a middle-aged man experienced in missing person investigations, was assigned to Jenna's case after similarities with Melissa Thompson's case. Another disappearance that had occurred in the same park emerged. Keith was known for his thoroughness and relentless approach, but he was also a man marked by failure in past cases. In his early years as a detective, he had lost more than one important case, and that burden had followed him to that point. Although he had gained some recognition in his career, those failures persisted in his mind like a shadow that never left him. However, he knew this case could be his opportunity for redemption. He needed to prove that he could still solve a complicated case, that he was not a man defeated by the weight of his past mistakes. As the investigation progressed, Keith found himself encountering a web of false leads and counterproofs that made him doubt himself. The lack of direct evidence in the park made things even more complicated. All the paths seemed to lead to a dead end. However, as he delved deeper into interviews with witnesses and people close to Jenna, he began to suspect that the connections between the previous disappearances and the current case were much closer than he had thought. Jenna's case was not an isolated crime. It was part of a larger pattern. But the question remained the same. Who was behind all this? Meanwhile, the community began to feel increasingly isolated and fearful. No one felt safe, and rumors of a serial killer began to circulate. However, something in the criminal's behavior made his profile even more bewildering. He was not a stranger. No one really knew who he was, but they did know that his movements were calculated and that he hid in the park's shadows, waiting for his next victim. The park, which had once been a place of leisure and tranquility, transformed into a hunting ground, and no one, not even those closest to Jenna, could imagine that danger was so near. The criminal was someone who knew how to manipulate people, how to go unnoticed, how to play with fear and distrust. Being someone close to the victim's environment, he had managed to deceive investigations up to that point, making the resolution of the case even more difficult. But Keith, despite his doubts, knew that the criminal was there, hidden in the fog of uncertainty, waiting for him to make the next mistake. It was only a matter of time before Jenna's case had an answer. But the question remained: who was the real killer? What motivated him to continue this series of crimes? These were the questions Keith had to solve before another life was lost in the darkness of the park. The central conflict of the story is not only about finding the responsible party for Jenna's disappearance, but also about the emotional impact this has on the characters involved. As the mystery continues to grow, the characters, especially Karen and Keith, must confront their own personal demons. For Karen, it is a fight to find her daughter, while for Keith, it is an opportunity to overcome his past and redeem his career. But at the same time, the real antagonist, the criminal, continues to lurk, testing everyone's endurance as the dark secrets of the community are slowly revealed. As Jenna's case developed, new details began to emerge, but each clue seemed to lead to a dead end. The young woman had been last seen pedaling down a little-used route in the park, but despite the efforts, no witness or evidence was found to help track her movements after that point. During the first days of the search, the police focused on exploring the possible routes Jenna might have taken, but with no conclusive results. The lack of testimony and the absence of traces made it clear that something more sinister was happening in the town. The most unsettling twist came several months later, when a body was found in a remote part of the park. Although the corpse was in an advanced state of decomposition, the cause of death was not immediately identified. The lack of concrete forensic evidence made the situation even more terrifying. Suspicions grew and rumors intensified in the community. The police, already under pressure due to Jenna's disappearance, now faced a new dimension of the case. Was this the body of Jenna? Or perhaps it belonged to a different victim? The doubt was unbearable for everyone, but especially for Karen, Jenna's mother, who still hadn't accepted the possibility that her daughter was dead. The pressure on Detective Keith grew as the days passed. Despite his experience, he found himself trapped in a deadlock. The complexity of the case had left him exhausted. Keith had been in difficult investigations before, but this case felt different. The parallels between Jenna's disappearance and the case of Melissa Thompson kept him on edge. The idea that both disappearances might be connected disturbed him even more. Initially, he had assumed the culprit could be a stranger, but after months of investigations, Keith began to see patterns suggesting that the killer was much closer than he had thought. He decided to investigate the behavior of the community's residents, interviewing neighbors and old acquaintances, but nothing seemed to fit. Everyone he interviewed provided a piece of information that only raised more questions. Some neighbors, visibly nervous, claimed not to have seen anything suspicious, but others began to hint that something was strange in the behavior of certain residents, though without evidence to support it. As Keith delved deeper, the sense of being trapped in a maze of lies and half-truths consumed him. The testimonies didn't match, and the clues seemed designed to confuse. Meanwhile, the disappearances and murders in the park did not cease. Isolated cases of missing persons, some of them no longer directly connected to Jenna, began to emerge, all related to the same park. As the number of victims increased, so did the community's fear. News of the murders spread quickly, and paranoia took a hold of everyone. Some began to suspect that the culprit might be an outsider, while others, more unsettled, started to question if the killer was part of the same town. The community residents became divided, and tensions grew. Keith found himself trapped in a dilemma. Every time he thought he was close to an answer, something made him backtrack. The details he thought he had carefully gathered crumbled in the face of new discoveries. He began to doubt his own abilities, something that had never happened before. The pressure to solve the case was pushing him to his limits, and he found himself sinking into growing frustration. How could he be so close and yet so far from the truth? What was happening in that park that made it so elusive, so impossible to decipher? Keith began to question whether perhaps there was a detail he had overlooked, a pattern he had missed in his eagerness to solve the case. Meanwhile, Karen refused to accept the possibility that her daughter had been murdered. Every time she got closer to the truth, Karen felt something pushing her to keep going. Her desperation took her beyond the limits of reason. She could not give up. Despite the unsettling signs, her love for Jenna kept her firm. The idea that her daughter might be dead was an unbearable truth, and that is why she kept searching, asking, investigating. Without the help of the police, she had started interviewing other family members and friends in the community, trying to find a clue that might shed some light on the mystery. The mother's anguish was palpable, but her determination to find her daughter never wavered. However, as the investigation progressed, doubts began to cloud her judgment. Was she searching for the truth, or simply holding on to a hope that perhaps no longer existed? As the tension mounted, the community became increasingly divided. Some neighbors, terrified by the idea that a killer was so close, began to look at each other with suspicion. The rumors that the killer might be among them gained strength, and accusations began to fly. Some began pointing fingers at certain individuals based on what little they knew about their past or recent behavior. Uncertainty and fear became tangible, and people once united by concern for Jenna now found themselves separated by distrust. The authorities, faced with a lack of clues, focused on interrogating the residents who had been near the park at the same time Jenna disappeared. But as new clues emerged, confusion only increased. Witnesses didn't match up, and clues that had seemed promising disappeared as quickly as they came. The officers found themselves trapped in a cycle of constant frustration, unable to move forward. Every attempt to solve the case only generated more questions. The feeling that something dark was hiding in the corners of the town, an evil that had yet to be discovered, began to invade everyone. The truth seemed further away than ever, and the park, which once had been a place of calm, had now become the epicenter of a nightmare. The search for Jenna and the growing threat of the killer became a race against time, and no one knew if they could truly stop what was brewing in the shadows. After years of endless searches, false trails, and the constant feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle, the truth finally revealed itself in an unexpected way. Detective Keith, who had immersed himself fully in Jenna's case, now almost obsessed with solving it, found a crucial clue that had been overlooked all along. While reviewing old reports and statements, a small piece of evidence, a seemingly insignificant detail, led him directly to the truth. The clue took him to a community register, something so mundane that no one had thought to link it to the case, but Keith, finally looking at it with fresh eyes, realized that it was the key. The killer, who had managed to stay one step ahead of the police all this time, had left an involuntary trace, a remnant of his presence in a place no one thought to search. This trace connected him to someone within the same community, someone who had been a respected and trusted member up to that point. The suspect was not a stranger, but someone integrated into the lives of the victims, someone who knew every corner of the park, every face, every behavior. Keith began to connect the dots, joining pieces that seemed nonsensical. The suspect had been a constant presence, but no one had ever suspected him. Over the years, his behavior had been carefully monitored by the police, but he had always managed to stay in the shadows, invisible. This discovery not only shocked Keith, but also gave a completely new perspective on everything that had happened in recent years. Finally, the moment of confrontation came. In a tense meeting, Keith confronted the killer. The conversation between them was pure tension. Keith could not believe that after all this time, the criminal was so close. During the encounter, the killer began to reveal his motivations, explaining how he had infiltrated the community, gaining everyone's trust, and how he had chosen his victims. The revelation was utterly devastating. The culprit was not a stranger or an outsider who had intruded into the town. He was someone who had been part of people's everyday lives, someone everyone knew but never suspected. The killer detailed his meticulous planning, how he had manipulated those around him, and how every move had been designed to go unnoticed. But the most shocking part of all was his explanation of why he chose Jenna and the other victims. They were not selected randomly. Each of them represented someone who had touched a dark part of his own life. Through his words, the killer revealed himself not just as a person capable of committing atrocities, but as someone who had nurtured his monstrosity over the years, hiding behind a facade the community never questioned. For Karen, the resolution of the case was a mixture of relief and desolation. Throughout all that time, she had held on to hope that her daughter would return, that the outcome would be different, that it had all been a nightmare. But when the truth finally came to light, the anguish of losing her daughter never faded. The pain of Jenna's death was irreversible, something that could never be overcome. The truth, though it provided answers, could not give back what she had lost. However, at least now Karen knew who had been responsible, and that clarity allowed her to take the first steps toward healing, however small they may have been. For the first time in years, she could breathe with something other than desperation. Although the loss was irreplaceable, justice had finally been done. Keith, for his part, felt that he had fulfilled his mission, but at a great personal cost. He had dedicated so much time, energy, and resources to this case that his own life had been relegated to second place. His obsession with solving it had pulled him away from everything else. His personal life, relationships, and health had all been affected. The weight of the case had transformed him. Although it was clear that the criminal had been caught, Keith could not help but feel empty. He had won professionally, but personally, he had lost more than he had gained. The end of this story leaves us with a deep reflection on human nature. The ability of evil to hide in the shadows, in the places we think are the safest, is something few can understand until they face the truth. And that truth, though painful and often unacceptable, is the only thing that can offer some sort of closure. In the end, the crime was solved, the killer was caught and brought to justice, but the wounds it left will never fully disappear. The community will never be the same. The park, which once was a place of leisure, will now be a constant reminder of what happened there. And for Karen and Keith, life will go on, but with the shadow of that truth over them, something that can never be erased. Truth will always be a double-edged sword, and only time will tell if in some way it becomes a means to heal the wounds of all those involved.